The carriage horse stood trembling, its breath pluming in the cold morning air, but the carriage itself was empty. Utterly empty except for a single object that defied all reason, a gold-tipped cane standing perfectly upright in the center of the red clay road. Its master was gone, and the slave who always walked behind him, Tobias Carter, was never seen again. But what really happened on that foggy Savannah road in 1838? The truth is far stranger than any legend. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The world was still steeped in the deep liquid blue of pre-dawn when Tobias Carter rose. It was a time of day he cherished, a brief stolen peace before the sun asserted its tyrannical reign over the Georgia coast. On the Vance plantation, the air was a heavy blanket woven from the smells of damp earth, sweet grass, and the distant salty tang of the marshes. The sounds were muted, a chorus of insects and the gentle rustle of Spanish moss in the ancient oaks, but beneath it all lay a silence that was not peaceful but coiled. It was the silence of bondage, a quiet that held its breath, waiting for the first command of the day. Tobias, a man in his late 30s, moved through this quiet with an economy born of years of servitude. His motions were deliberate, never wasted, a physical manifestation of a mind that was always watching, always listening. His resilience was not a fire, but a deep, cool well within him, a place untouched by the daily degradations. He was a shadow in the pre-dawn, his presence felt more than seen. From the main house, a single lamp was lit. Elias Vance was awake. Tobias's routine began. He drew water, checked the harnesses, and prepared the elegant black carriage that was Vance's throne. Soon the master himself emerged, a figure as severe and unyielding as the Georgia sun at noon. Vance was a man whose pride was his most prominent feature, a brittle armor he wore against the world. In his hand, he carried the instrument of his will, an ebony cane tipped with a gleaming knob of gold. He never seemed to walk without it, and it served as his voice when dealing with Tobias. He never addressed the enslaved man directly, a calculated denial of his humanity. Instead, the cane did the talking. A sharp rap on the carriage door meant open it. A flick towards the horse meant check its shoe. A tap on the polished floor meant the journey begins. This was their daily ritual, a grim procession that defined their existence. Vance, cocooned in the relative comfort of his carriage, would journey into Savannah for his business dealings, his face a mask of stern importance. And Tobias, regardless of the weather, would walk the entire way behind it. He was a human shadow tethered to his master's wealth, his bare feet intimately familiar with every stone, root, and rut in the long red clay road. The rhythmic squeak of the carriage wheels was the metronome of his life, a sound so constant he sometimes heard it in his sleep. The grit of the red clay worked its way into the calluses of his feet, a permanent stain that marked him as property of this land. The journey was a silent testament to the chasm between their two worlds, a chasm measured in the few yards of dust that separated the walking man from the riding master. The night before the final journey, the air had felt different. The usual humidity was there, but it carried a new weight, a sense of gathering. Tobias sat on a low stool outside the small cabin that served as his home, listening to the wisdom of Sarah. She was the oldest woman in the quarters, a spiritual anchor for the small community of enslaved people. and the closest thing Tobias had to a mother. Her face was a beautiful map of wrinkles, each line a story, her eyes holding the deep, knowing calm of one who has seen too much of life to be surprised by it. She was a keeper of the old ways, the Gulagichi traditions that were a lifeline to a past almost erased. Her hands, gnarled from a lifetime of labor, were surprisingly gentle as she pressed a small, smooth object into Tobias's palm. It was carved from a dark, heavy wood, polished by countless touches, and it felt cool against his skin. "The fog is coming in thick tomorrow, Tobias," she said, her voice a low, melodic hum like the buzzing of bees in a hollow tree. "Thicker than I've seen it in a long time. The mist has a memory, you know. Sometimes it remembers what the living try to forget. Sometimes it opens a door for those who know how to look." Tobias closed his fingers around the wooden charm. Its coolness seemed to seep into his bones, a strange comfort. "A door to where, Mama Sarah?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She looked past him, her gaze fixed on the dark line of trees that bordered the fields, as if she could see the coming mist gathering there. "To a place where a man's soul can stand up straight." Her words settled in the air between them, heavy with a meaning he could not quite grasp. He felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the night air, a sense of foreboding tangled with a fragile, mystical sliver of hope. He didn't understand, not fully, but he felt the weight of her prophecy. He slipped the charm into the small pocket of his trousers, the wood a solid, secret presence against his leg. The morning came, and the world was gone. Sarah had been right. The fog was a living thing, a dense white wall that had swallowed the landscape whole. It pressed in from all sides, muffling sound, distorting distance, and erasing the familiar lines of the plantation. The great house was a faint, ghostly silhouette, the towering oaks reduced to smudges of gray. It was a world undone, returned to a state of formless, quiet chaos. The journey began as it always did. Vance emerged from the house, his form indistinct in the gloom, and rapped his cane once against the carriage door. The sound was flat, absorbed by the thick air. Tobias fell into his place behind the carriage, his feet finding the familiar ruts of the road by memory alone. But this time, everything was different. As they moved away from the relative clarity of the plantation yard and onto the main road, the fog thickened into an impenetrable blanket. Soon the elegant carriage was just a faint, dark outline ahead of him, a ghost ship sailing on a sea of white. The rhythmic squeak of the wheels and the plodding hoofbeats of the horse became distant, ethereal sounds, as if they were coming from another world. The oppressive reality of his life, the constant watchful presence of his master began to dissolve. He was alone in the whiteness. He reached into his pocket and his fingers found the wooden charm. As he clutched it, he felt a strange, low hum in the air, a vibration that seemed to come not through his ears, but up from the soles of his feet, from the red clay of the earth itself. It was a deep, resonant frequency that vibrated in his bones, a note of ancient power. The fear that had been a constant companion for all his adult life began to recede, replaced by a strange and profound sense of calm, a feeling of inevitability. The world he knew with its rigid lines of power and pain was dissolving into the white emptiness around him, and in its place something new and unknown was taking shape. Hours later, on the outskirts of Savannah, the spell was broken. A lone carriage horse, its coat damp with mist and its eyes wide with confusion, trotted unevenly into the yard of a stable, pulling the empty black carriage behind it. The stable master, a man named Jebediah, came out expecting to greet Elias Vance. He found the carriage door slightly ajar, the velvet seat empty, and no sign of the severe cane-wielding master. Alarmed and confused, he raised the alarm, assuming Vance had met with some unfortunate accident or foul play along the way. The narrative of that morning, however, was not to be found in Savannah. It was back on the red clay road where the fog was finally beginning to thin, burned away by the rising sun. A traveling preacher, guiding his small cart and mule through the lingering wisps of mist, pulled up short, his mouth falling open in disbelief. There in the precise center of the road stood Elias Vance's ornate gold-tipped ebony cane. It was not lying in the dirt, nor was it leaning against anything. It was standing perfectly, impossibly upright on its narrow tip, as if it had been planted in the hard, packed soil like a strange, dark flower. The preacher, a man who thought he had seen all the wonders and oddities the world had to offer, could only stare. He cautiously climbed down from his cart and approached the object. The air was still. There were no footprints in the damp clay around the cane, none at all save for the tracks of the carriage that had clearly already passed that way. The scene was silent, serene, and utterly inexplicable. It was a violation of reason, a quiet miracle, or a terrifying omen. The preacher, his heart pounding with a holy and unholy fear, quickly turned his cart around. He had to tell someone. He had to tell everyone. Panic and rumor, twin wildfires, were about to ignite. The news of the upright cane and the empty carriage ripped through the Savannah morning like a cannon shot. A search party was formed with brutal efficiency, led not by a concerned citizen but by the plantation's overseer, a man named Finch. Finch was built of gristle and impatience, a man who governed through fear and believed the only solution to any problem was a swift application of force. He rode at the head of a dozen armed men, their mood a volatile cocktail of confusion, anger, and a grim, thrilling excitement. They thundered back down the red clay road, the rising sun casting long, sharp shadows before them. The spot was just as the preacher had described. The cane was gone, taken as evidence by the first official to arrive, but the impossible indentation it had left in the packed earth remained. A small, perfect circle that seemed to mock them with its placid emptiness. Finch spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt, his eyes scanning the dense, humid woods that bordered the road. "He's a runaway, that's all," he snarled, his voice a gravelly rasp that carried over the nervous muttering of his men. "Probably got spooked and thought he could make a break for it. Got eaten by a gator trying to cross the marsh, I'd wager. Find me a body. I want this settled before Vance's breakfast gets cold." His men, emboldened by his certainty, plunged into the underbrush. Their search was loud and careless, a violation of the swamp's morning quiet. They crashed through palmetto thickets, their boots sinking into the soft black mud. They shouted Tobias's name, the sound swallowed by the thick vegetation and the oppressive humidity. They were not looking for a man, they were hunting an animal, their actions devoid of any thought beyond capture. One of the younger men, his face pale with a sweat that was not entirely from the heat, rode up beside the overseer. "But what about the cane, Mr. Finch?" he asked, his voice low. "Standing up on its own like that? It ain't natural." Finch shot him a look of pure contempt. "A trick," he snapped, his hand resting on the butt of the pistol at his hip. "A devil's trick to spook us, some root doctor nonsense to buy him time. When I find that boy, he'll learn all about tricks. Now get back to it. I want every inch of this swamp turned inside out." The men continued their futile search, trampling the delicate ferns and spooking the unseen creatures of the marsh. They were men of iron and leather, of whips and guns, and they were utterly incapable of comprehending an event that defied their rigid worldview of power and control. The swamp held its secrets close, its ancient silence undisturbed by their noise and fury. They found no tracks, no broken branches, no sign of a man's passage. They found nothing. It was as if Tobias Carter had simply been erased from the world. Finch returned to the plantation hours later, his face a thundercloud of frustration. The sun was high and hot now, beating down on the slave quarters and baking the silence into the very air. His failed search had curdled his temper into pure venom, and he needed a target. He stormed into the quarters, his whip coiled in his hand, and began the interrogations. He grabbed men and women at random, his questions like lashes themselves, demanding answers they did not have. Where is he? Who helped him? Who knew about this trick? His violence was a blunt instrument meant to shatter the community's composure and spill its secrets. He finally fixed his furious gaze on Sarah. He strode towards her cabin, his boots kicking up dust. She was sitting on her small porch mending a shirt, her movements as calm and steady as if she were merely watching the clouds pass. She looked up as he approached, her eyes holding no fear, only a deep, unnerving stillness. "Old woman, you know something," Finch growled, looming over her. "Your kind always deals in roots and whispers. He was your favorite. Where is he?" Sarah met his glare without flinching, her needle pausing in its work. "The swamp has many secrets, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice soft but clear as a bell. "So does the Lord. Tobias is with one of them now." Her cryptic defiance was like fuel on his fire. He saw a movement from the corner of his eye and spun around. A young, strong-willed man named James stood there, his fists clenched at his sides, his eyes blazing with a hatred he was too proud to hide. James had looked up to Tobias, had seen in the older man's quiet endurance a strength he hoped to emulate. Finch saw the defiance in James's posture as a direct challenge to his authority. He smiled, a cruel twisting of his lips. "You," he said, pointing the handle of his whip at James. "You got something to say." James's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his defiance a wall of pure will. "No. Well, maybe this will loosen your tongue." The whip uncoiled with a sound like a striking snake. The lash fell across James's back, tearing through his thin shirt and leaving a bright red welt. James cried out, stumbling forward, but he did not fall. Finch raised the whip again, the act a release for his own mounting impotence. The brutal lashing that followed served no purpose but to sow terror, a desperate attempt to reassert control in the face of a mystery he could not solve. The sounds echoed across the silent quarters, a stark reminder of the violent reality that underpinned their world, a reality that had, for one impossible morning, seemed to bend. While Finch terrorized the quarters, Elias Vance was locked in a prison of his own making. The news had reached him not as a report of a runaway, but as a story of an impossible spectacle. The financial loss of an enslaved man was a significant annoyance, a matter for the ledgers and insurers. But the disappearance of his cane, the very symbol of his identity and authority, and the inexplicable theatrical way it had been left felt like a deeply personal, supernatural violation. He was not just furious, he was psychologically disturbed, unmoored from the solid ground of his own reality. He had spent the morning pacing the grand veranda of his house, his hand often twitching at his side, instinctively reaching for the phantom weight of the ebony cane. Now, as the afternoon wore on, he sat in a large armchair, a glass of brandy in his hand, staring into the distance where the road disappeared into the trees. He had begun drinking before noon, but the alcohol did nothing to dull the sharp edges of his unease. His mind kept returning to the cane. It was more than just a walking stick, more than an instrument for issuing commands. It had been a gift from his father, carved from the heart of an ancient oak on the property. It was an heirloom, a scepter, an extension of his will. Its gold tip shone with the luster of his family's wealth. Its dark wood held the gravity of his authority. To walk without it felt like walking without a limb. To have it taken, and not just taken, but used in some bizarre, mocking ritual, was an insult so profound he could not even properly articulate it. It was a direct challenge to his power, not from another man of his station, but from the very fabric of the world he thought he commanded. He felt a creeping sense of impotence, a vulnerability he had never known. The mystery of it gnawed at him, an unanswerable question that echoed in the silent halls of his grand house. How could a man vanish? How could a cane stand on its own? The questions were a poison, and he had no antidote. He was a man who believed in order, in power, in the clear and brutal logic of master and slave. What had happened on the red clay road was chaos. It was magic. It was a language he did not speak, and it was driving him mad. Weeks passed. The official search was called off. The whispers on the plantation died down, buried under the weight of daily labor and the renewed threat of Finch's whip. But a story, once planted, has roots of its own. In a dimly lit Savannah tavern smelling of stale beer and sawdust, the legend of Tobias Carter began to grow. A traveling merchant, his face flushed with whiskey and the thrill of a good story, told a hushed, frightened tale to a captive audience of sailors and dock workers. He had been on the road from the west, he claimed, traveling at dusk a week or so after the disappearance, when the fog had rolled in thick from the marshes. He swore on his mother's grave that he had seen two figures walking together on that lonely stretch of road. It was unnatural, the merchant whispered, leaning forward, his eyes wide. The tavern grew quiet, the men leaning in to listen. The fog was thick as cotton. You couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. And there they were, two shadows walking side by side where no living men should be. They didn't make a sound. One was tall and built like a field hand, straight and proud, but the other was different. He paused for dramatic effect, taking a long swallow of his drink. The other was like part of the fog itself, a darkness moving within the white. It wasn't a man, not really, it was something older, something that belonged to the swamp. They walked together not like a master and a slave, but like equals. And then they were just gone, swallowed by the mist. The story spread from that tavern like a contagion. It was told and retold, embellished with each telling. The legend of Tobias and his shadow companion was born, taking on a life of its own. For the white settlers of Savannah, it became a ghost story, a chilling tale to be told around the fire, a warning to avoid that stretch of road after dark. But for the enslaved communities scattered across the coastal plains, it was something else entirely. It was a story of hope. It was a whisper of mystical power, a testament to a freedom that could not be bought or sold, a freedom of the soul. It was the story of a man who did not just run, but who walked away with the spirit of the land itself, leaving behind only a symbol of his oppression, standing upright in defiance. The cane itself was not born of gentle hands or noble purpose. Its history was as dark and twisted as the branches of the ancient oak from which it was carved. In his escalating paranoia, Elias Vance found his thoughts circling back to its creation, a memory he had long suppressed, polished over like the gold tip he'd had affixed to its end. The tree had been a landmark on the property long before his father built the main house. A colossal, sprawling oak whose lowest branches, thick as a man's waist, reached out like accusing arms. It was known, in hushed tones and averted gazes, as the hanging tree. Decades prior, before Vance's time, it had been the site of brutal retribution against a small group of rebellious slaves, their bodies left to turn in the wind as a grim warning. The tree had absorbed that sorrow, that terror, into its very grain. Years later, a younger, even more ruthless Elias Vance had decided to fashion a new walking stick, one that would command more respect than the simple hickory staff he had been using. He ordered the heartwood of the hanging tree's largest limb to be cut and seasoned. He remembered the unease of the enslaved man tasked with the job, the way his eyes would not meet Vance's as he sawed into the wood that was a monument to his people's suffering. Once the cane was carved, sanded, and oiled to a dark, malevolent sheen. It felt heavy in Vance's hand, imbued with a cold, hard authority. It was not long before he consecrated it in his own act of cruelty. An enslaved man, barely a man at all, more of a boy, had made a desperate run for freedom. He was caught within a day, dragged back to the plantation, and tied to the trunk of that same ancient oak. Vance, his face a mask of cold fury, had used the newly fashioned cane. He had not used a whip, which was for punishment. He used the cane, which was for command, turning it into an instrument of torture. In front of all the others gathered and forced to watch, he beat the boy mercilessly. The sound of the hard ebony striking flesh and bone was a sickening thud that echoed the finality of a closing coffin. With every strike, Vance felt not just the boy's resistance breaking, but his own authority hardening, crystallizing into an object he could hold. The act cemented the cane as an object of pure terror, a physical extension of his will. This memory, once a source of grim pride, now haunted him. The cane was not just a symbol of his power, it was a repository of his most profound cruelty, a sin he had tried to disguise with a tip of gold. He had not simply lost a possession, he had lost a piece of his own dark soul, and it had been left standing in the road as if in judgment of him. While Vance was unraveling in his great house, a different kind of history was being shared in the quiet of the quarters. James's back was healing, the welts turning to dark scars, but a deeper wound festered within him. His anger was a hot coal in his chest, and his eyes held the dangerous glint of vengeance. He spoke of running, of fighting, of making Finch pay for the humiliation. Sarah, seeing this, knew that his anger, if left untended, would lead him only to the same fate as the boy under the hanging tree. One evening, as twilight softened the edges of the world, she led him away from the others down to a quiet spot by the creek where the water whispered over smooth stones. She did not speak of forgiveness or patience. Instead, she began to tell him a story, an old Gullah Geechee folktale passed down through generations, not as a child's tale, but as a lesson in the nature of power and freedom. The tale was about a great ancestor, a man who was a captive in a land far from his home. He was bound to a cruel master by an invisible chain, a chain forged not of iron but of the master's will, which was held within his most prized possession, a carved mask. The ancestor prayed not for escape but for liberation. The spirits of the land heard his plea and came to him in a dream. They told him that to be free he had to enter their world, a world that existed alongside the physical one, a world the masters could not see or touch. But to pass through the door between worlds he had to leave behind the most powerful object that tied him to his master, severing the spiritual chain of bondage forever. "Freedom ain't just about running north, James," Sarah said, her voice low and steady as the flow of the creek. "That's just changing one cage for another, always looking over your shoulder. True freedom is when your soul can't be owned, when it can't be bought or whipped or sold." Tobias knew that. James looked at her, his anger momentarily forgotten, replaced by a deep, questioning curiosity. "He didn't run," she continued, her gaze distant as if she were seeing the events of that foggy morning playing out again in the twilight. "He paid a price. He understood the nature of that cane, the history it held. He knew it wasn't just a stick, it was the anchor that held Vance's power to this world. And it was the chain around his own neck." Tobias walked through a door. "James, he left the chain behind for all to see." To understand what Sarah meant, one would have had to be with Tobias on the road that morning, to see the world not as a solid, dependable thing, but as a canvas upon which older realities could be painted. As the fog became absolute, a white, silent universe unto itself, the oppressive weight of Vance's presence in the carriage ahead simply ceased to exist. The world was reduced to the damp clay beneath Tobias's feet, and the thick, swirling air around him. It was then that the small wooden charm in his pocket, the one Sarah had given him, grew hot against his leg, a burning point of focus in the cold, damp air. The low hum he had felt coming from the earth intensified, becoming a vibration that resonated through his entire body, shaking loose the years of fear and submission. He felt a presence coalesce from the mist beside him. It was not a sudden appearance, but a gradual gathering, as if the fog itself was weaving a form out of memory and shadow. The second shadow of the legend. It was not a person, not a ghost in the way the white settlers imagined. It was an ancient, elemental spirit of the place, of the swamp, the river, and the land that had soaked up the blood and tears of generations. It was the collective consciousness of the ancestors, those who had been brought in chains and those who had been born into them, their spirits tied to the red Georgia soil. The communication was not verbal, there were no words. Instead, the spirit flooded Tobias's mind with a torrent of images and feelings, a history more potent and true than any written book. He felt the terror of the Middle Passage, the suffocating darkness of the ship's hold, the despair of a people stolen from their world. He felt the deep, aching sorrow of generations in bondage, the sting of the lash, the agony of families torn apart. But beneath it all, he felt something else, something the masters could never understand. He felt the enduring, unbreakable strength of their spirit, the resilience that allowed them to sing in the face of despair, to love in a world of hate, to hold on to their humanity when all was done to strip it from them. It was not a story being told to him. It was a truth being poured into him. It was a test. Could he bear the weight of this inheritance and still stand? In that sacred, silent space within the fog, the spirit offered Tobias a choice. It was not a choice between slavery and freedom in the conventional sense. It was a choice between two different kinds of freedom, each with its own price. First, the spirit showed him a vision of a physical escape. He saw himself running through the night, dodging patrols, his heart a frantic drum of fear. He saw himself crossing the great river into the north, a free man by law, but a man forever haunted, looking over his shoulder, starting at shadows, his soul still branded by the memory of the whip. He would be free, but he would never be at peace. Then the spirit showed him another path. It was not a path of running, but of standing still. It was a path of transcendence, emerging with the spirit of the land itself, becoming a guardian of its memory, a permanent symbol of eternal defiance. He would cease to be Tobias Carter, the slave. He would become a story, a legend, a presence in the mist that would give hope to the hopeless and instill a deep, unknowable fear in the hearts of the oppressors. He would be a protector of his people, not with a weapon, but with the power of his story. To accept this spiritual freedom, however, he had to perform the ritual act. He had to complete the ceremony his ancestor in the folk tale had only dreamed of. He had to seize the ultimate symbol of his oppression, the anchor of his master's power, and use it to mark his passage from the world of flesh and iron to the world of spirit and memory. A profound calm settled over Tobias. The choice was no choice at all. He had been walking behind his master his entire life. Now he would walk a path of his own. In a moment of pure, undiluted will, he stepped forward. The fog seemed to part for him, and he saw the carriage, silent and still. He saw Elias Vance, his face pale and confused, peering out into the white emptiness, his hand holding the ebony cane. Vance looked up and saw Tobias approaching, but his mind could not process it. The order of his world was breaking. A slave did not approach, a slave did not meet his master's gaze. Tobias reached the carriage. His hand, steady and sure, closed over the top of the cane, his fingers touching his master's. For a single electric moment they were connected by the dark wood. Vance's hand was unresisting, his mind paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the act. Tobias drew the cane from his master's limp grasp. The act was silent, swift, and absolute. He turned from the carriage, walked to the center of the road, and with all the strength of his ancestors flowing through him, he planted the cane in the red clay. It stood perfectly balanced, a dark exclamation point against the white fog. As the cane found its footing, Tobias felt his own form dissolving, the solid lines of his body loosening, becoming as ethereal as the mist around him. He was no longer flesh and bone, but memory and will, joining the ancient shadow that waited for him. Two figures standing tall as their path forward became the fog itself. Vance's plantation house, once the proud epicenter of his dominion, had become a labyrinth of torment. The grand rooms with their high ceilings and polished mahogany furniture that reflected the light in distorted, elongated shapes now felt cavernous and hostile. Their opulent silence was a canvas upon which his unraveling mind painted its terrors. Sleep offered no sanctuary. It was a shallow, treacherous country populated by nightmares from which he was constantly startled awake, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was always woken by the same sound or the ghost of a sound, the soft, imagined tread of bare feet on the heart pine floorboards in the hallway just outside his bedroom door. He would lie rigid in the darkness of his four-poster bed, straining to hear, his breath held tight in his chest, waiting for a sound that never fully materialized, but whose presence was a certainty. During his waking hours, which were nearly all of them, he was tormented by the periphery of his own vision. A flicker of movement in the long-shadowed hallway, a dark shape in a corner that seemed to shift and recoil when he wasn't looking directly at it. These were his constant silent companions. He took to sitting in the center of the parlor, his back to no wall, his gaze darting from door to window, trying to keep the entire room in his line of sight, a paranoid king besieged in the very heart of his castle. His spiraling obsession finally coalesced around a single immovable object, the source of the cane's wood, the ancient, gnarled hanging tree. It stood on a low rise overlooking the cotton fields, a dark skeletal silhouette against the bruised colors of the sky, a constant silent accusation on the horizon. He watched its shadow stretch towards the house in the late afternoon sun and imagined it was a grasping hand, the source of the whispers that plagued his waking moments. In a final, violent paroxysm of desperation, he ordered the tree to be chopped down. The enslaved men he sent to the task were visibly unnerved, their axes striking the wood with a hesitant reluctance, as if they were committing a sacrilege. It took them 2 full days to fell the giant, its final groaning crash echoing across the plantation like the death rattle of something ancient. But it was not enough for it to be down. It had to be obliterated, erased from memory and from the earth itself. He ordered the massive trunk and limbs to be sawn, dragged, and piled high into a monstrous pyre. He watched it burn all night from the cold stone of his veranda, a bottle of French brandy untouched at his side. The flames leaped high into the black starless sky, a furious roaring orange against the profound darkness. The act brought him no peace, only a more profound and intimate torment. The thick resinous smoke did not dissipate and drift away, but seemed to cling to the ground, twisting and writhing into accusing shapes that his fevered mind interpreted as grasping hands. and the contorted, sorrowful faces of the men who had died on its branches. In the constant, hungry crackling and popping of the flames, he imagined he heard whispers, the soft, sibilant sound of his own name, Elias, being spoken over and over, Janul, a chorus of condemnation from the fire itself. He was trying to burn away a memory, but the fire only illuminated it, searing the image of the upright cane, the swirling fog, and the quiet, impossibly defiant face of Tobias Carter onto the back of his eyelids. By dawn, when the fire had died down to a vast breathing mountain of glowing red embers, Vance felt a coldness in his soul that no fire could ever warm. He had not destroyed a ghost, he had merely desecrated its tomb, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the very marrow of his bones that it would not be forgiven. While Elias Vance descended into his private self-made hell, the story of Tobias ascended into public legend. The tale of the two shadows of the Savannah road became common folklore, a piece of the landscape's living history, as real to the people of the coast as the tides and the Spanish moss. The road itself, once a simple artery of commerce and travel, was transformed. It was now considered haunted ground, a place where the veil between the world of the living and the world of spirits was thin and permeable. After sunset, it was largely abandoned. Wagon drivers, their faces grim in the lantern light, would take longer, more arduous routes through treacherous marshland just to avoid it. Those who had no choice but to travel it did so with a prayer on their lips and a frantic, whip-cracking urgency in their pace. In Savannah, mothers warned their children not to stray too close to the road's edge when visiting the countryside, and its name was spoken in hushed tones in taverns and parlors, synonymous with a mystery and an unsettling power that defied the simple, brutal laws of man. The legend, however, held a different, deeper meaning for the enslaved community, spreading from plantation to plantation through a network of whispers and coded songs. It was not a ghost story to be feared. It was a secret scripture of hope. In a cabin late at night, an old woman might gather the children close and tell the story not of a terrifying specter, but of a clever man who made a pact with the land itself. She would describe how Tobias, with the help of the ancient spirits, had turned the master's own power, the cane, against him, using it as a key to open a door to freedom. The story became a powerful, unspoken tool of spiritual resistance. It implied that there was a justice that operated outside the master's laws, a power in the soil, the trees, and the fog that could not be chained or whipped. This subtle shift in morale was a constant, unspoken challenge to the plantation's authority. A shared, knowing glance between two men toiling in the suffocating heat of the fields, a woman humming a low, mournful tune that suddenly held a note of triumphant defiance. These were the small, invisible ways the story manifested. It did not inspire open rebellion, for that would have been suicide. Instead, it nurtured an internal, spiritual rebellion. It straightened backs that had been bent for a lifetime. It lifted chins that had been perpetually lowered. It put a quiet, steady light in eyes that had long held only the dull reflection of despair. The story of Tobias taught them that a master could own your body, but he could not own your soul unless you surrendered it. He had not run from his master, he had transcended him, and in doing so he had left a trail of hope for others to follow, not with their feet but with their spirits. Finch, the overseer, a man of practical brutality and no imagination, watched his employer's psychological collapse with a growing mixture of contempt and alarm. He had no time for ghosts, curses, or the delicate nuances of a troubled mind. He saw the world in simple, stark terms: discipline, labor, and fear. The legend of Tobias was, to him, a dangerous infection in the workforce, a rot in the foundations of the order he maintained through the strategic application of pain. He saw the new quiet light in the slave's eyes and recognized it for what it was: a challenge. He saw Vance's obsessive, drunken paralysis not as a personal tragedy but as a dereliction of duty, a weakness that threatened the entire enterprise. Finally, unable to stand the corrosive inaction any longer, he strode into the main house's dusty, shuttered study, determined to shock his master back to reality. "Sir, with all due respect, you must pull yourself together," Finch began, his voice blunt and devoid of sympathy. Vance sat hunched in a wingback chair, his fine clothes stained and rumpled, staring at the empty space on the wall where a portrait of his father used to hang. He looked as if he had aged a decade in a few short weeks. "The whispers are making the hands bold. They work slower, they look at you with something other than fear in their eyes when they think you can't see. It's poison. We need to make an example. We need to restore fear. Let me take a few of the men, find the ones telling the stories, and break this legend's back with a bullwhip. A public demonstration is the only cure for this kind of sickness." Vance turned his head slowly, his movements stiff, his eyes wild and bloodshot, glittering with a paranoid fire in the dim light of the study. "Fear?" he rasped, his voice a dry, cracking rustle of leaves. He rose unsteadily from his chair, his body trembling with a sudden, furious energy that seemed to come from the very depths of his madness. "You know nothing of fear. You think this is about discipline? About bold hands?" He took a staggering step towards Finch, his finger jabbing the air between them. "This is a curse. He cursed me. That black devil put a curse on me and my house and my name." His voice rose to a near shriek, cracking with hysteria. "And you," he hissed, his eyes narrowing with the force of a sudden, insane revelation, "you were there. You were supposed to be watching the road. You came back with nothing but excuses. Perhaps you are in on it. Perhaps you let him go." Finch stared, momentarily stunned into silence by the sheer raving madness of the accusation. He who had built his entire career on the ruthless control and subjugation of the enslaved, being accused of complicity in an escape was beyond absurdity. "Sir, that's crazy talk," he stammered, taking an involuntary step back from the unhinged man before him. "I've served your family for 15 years. "Get out," Vance whispered, his voice dropping to a dangerously low and venomous register. "You are dismissed. Your incompetence, your betrayal, I see it all now. You were jealous of my authority, so you are part of it. Get off my land before I have you shot like a common trespasser." The act was absolute, a final paranoid severing of his last connection to the practical, brutal reality of his own power. Finch, his face a mask of disbelief that quickly hardened into cold fury, turned without another word and stormed out of the house. He did not look back at the madman in the dusty room. He was leaving a sinking ship, and as he rowed away, he felt not pity for Vance, but a profound disgust. The master of the plantation was now completely and utterly alone with his ghosts. The departure of Finch was the final stone removed from the crumbling dam of Vance's sanity. Now there was no one left to buffer him from the phantoms of his own mind, no voice of brutal pragmatism to ground him. The days bled into one another in a seamless, timeless haze of alcohol and terror. The whispers in the house grew louder, the shadows in the corners bolder and more defined. He was a prisoner in his own home, a ghost in his own life, haunted by the memory of a man and a cane. Finally, driven to the very brink of insanity, a desperate, defiant idea took root in the barren soil of his mind. He could not burn the ghost, he could not drink it away, so he would confront it. He would return to the site of his humiliation, to that exact spot on the red clay road, and he would reclaim it. He would stand there in the morning light and prove to the world, and more importantly, to the cowering thing that was left of his own soul, that it was just a piece of empty road, that the memory held no power over him. His actions, for the first time in weeks, took on a grim, ritualistic purpose. He ordered a carriage prepared for the following morning to depart at the exact same time as the original fateful journey. He would travel alone. He spent the evening in his study, not drinking, but meticulously cleaning and loading a matched pair of silver-inlaid dueling pistols. His hands, which had trembled for weeks, were surprisingly steady, his movements precise and deliberate. A mask of grim, almost ecstatic determination had settled over his features, replacing the slack-jawed terror of the preceding weeks. He was no longer just a victim of the haunting, he was preparing for a confrontation. He was going to war with a memory, and he would be armed. As dawn approached, casting its first pale gray spectral light over the plantation, he dressed himself not in his usual fine attire, but in sturdy riding clothes of dark wool. He placed the pistols securely in his belt, their cold, heavy weight against his stomach, a small, solid comfort in a world that had become fluid and uncertain. He walked out of the great house, his back straight for the first time in months, and climbed into the waiting carriage. He did not look back at the house or the fields. He was embarking on a final pilgrimage, a journey back to the source of his unraveling. A lone traveler heading into the heart of his own personal darkness, determined to either conquer the ghost or be utterly and finally consumed by it. The carriage wheels crunched on the damp red clay, the sound unnaturally loud in the expectant silence of the dawn. Elias Vance arrived at the place. He knew it not by any specific landmark, for the road was depressingly uniform in its poverty, but by an internal compass of dread that had been spinning wildly within him for weeks and now, finally, pointed due north. He brought the horse to a halt, and as if summoned by his very presence, the morning fog, which had until that moment been a low, drifting haze, began to thicken. It did not simply roll in from the marshes, it seemed to rise from the earth itself. A pale, cold exhalation from the red clay, coalescing out of the air, recreating the conditions of his undoing with a quiet, theatrical malevolence. The world dissolved into a soft gray emptiness, the familiar lines of the trees blurring into indistinct smudges before vanishing entirely. The only solid things left in the universe were him, the carriage, and the suffocating silent whiteness. He sat for a long moment, the loaded pistols a cold, heavy reassurance against his stomach. This was it. The stage was set. He pushed open the carriage door, the sound a dull thud that was immediately swallowed by the mist. He stepped down onto the road, his boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. He stood in the precise center of the road, the spot where his authority had been stolen and left standing as a mocking totem. He breathed in the thick, wet air, which smelled of pine and decay and something else, something ancient and watchful. He would not be a victim. He would be a challenger. He filled his lungs and he called out, his voice tearing through the profound silence, a sound that was a mixture of a master's command, a prosecutor's rage, and the desperate hidden plea of a child lost in the dark. "Tobias!" The name was ripped from his throat, raw and cracking. "Show yourself. I am still your master. You are my property, bound by law, and by God, you will answer to me." His voice did not echo, it was simply absorbed into the fog, a futile shout into a feather pillow. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of his own ragged breathing and the frantic, terrified pounding of his own heart. He was alone, shouting at a ghost on an empty road, a madman giving orders to the mist. A sliver of the terror he had been living with for weeks threatened to overwhelm him, the cold certainty that he was in fact completely and utterly insane. But then, the fog before him began to move. It was not a drift or a swirl caused by some unseen current of air. It was a deliberate gathering, a thickening, a coalescing of the white vapor into something with substance and form. In response to his call, two figures slowly, impossibly took shape out of the densest part of the fog. One was clearly Tobias, but it was not the Tobias he knew, not the man who walked with his gaze perpetually lowered, his shoulders slightly stooped in a posture of lifelong submission. This Tobias stood tall and straight, his form both solid and yet strangely translucent, as if he were carved from smoked glass. He wore the same simple trousers and shirt as the day he vanished, but they seemed to hang on a frame that was no longer merely human. He was not the property of Elias Vance. He was an entity of the land itself, his feet seeming to be rooted in the red clay, his head touching the low gray ceiling of the fog. His face was calm, his eyes holding not defiance, not anger, but a vast, ancient, and untroubled peace. He was no longer a slave, he was a sovereign presence. Beside him, slightly taller and less distinct, was the second shadow of the legend. It was a swirling ancient form that seemed to be woven from the fog and from memory itself. It had no discernible features, only a shifting, columnar darkness within the mist, a presence that radiated an immense, imperturbable power, the calm of a mountain or a deep ocean trench. It was the spirit of the place, the accumulated soul of the swamp and the sorrow, and it stood beside Tobias not as a master but as an equal, a silent partner in this final silent reckoning. Vance, seeing them, was frozen in place. The sight was so much more terrible and so much more real than anything his fevered mind had ever conjured. A wave of pure, primal terror washed over him, so cold it felt like his blood was turning to ice. But mingled with the terror was a hot, sharp spike of vindication. He was not mad. It was real. The ghost was real, and it had answered his challenge. This was not a phantom of the mind, it was an enemy he could face. He fumbled for the pistols at his belt, his hands shaking, but some instinct told him they would be useless here. This was not a battle to be fought with lead and powder. It was a battle of will, the only kind of battle he had ever truly believed in. He had to restore the order he understood, the fundamental law of his universe. "Get back in your place," he commanded, his voice a strained, trembling imitation of his former authority. He pointed a shaking finger at the ground behind the spectral carriage that only he could see in his memory. "Walk behind the carriage. That is your place." The figure of Tobias did not move. The only response was a voice. And it was a voice that Vance had almost never heard, but it was one he recognized. It was calm, resonant, and it seemed to come not from the translucent figure's mouth, but from the air itself, from the fog, from the trees, from the very ground beneath his feet. "My place is here," the voice of Tobias said, without malice, without anger, simply stating a fact as immutable as the rising of the sun. "Your power is in the road, Master Vance. Buried in the clay with your cane, it held you up, but it held me down. But my path is my own now." The simple, calm denial of his authority shattered the last of Vance's composure. This was the ultimate insubordination, a rejection not just of an order, but of the entire structure of his world. With a guttural roar of pure, frustrated rage, he lunged forward, his hands outstretched like claws, intending to physically seize the apparition, to force it to its knees, to prove that what was his, even in death, even in madness. He threw himself at the space where Tobias stood, a final, desperate act of will. He did not pass through the figure as one might expect of a ghost. Instead, he hit a barrier. It was not a hard, solid wall that would have broken his bones, but an invisible, yielding surface, like pushing against the immense, gentle pressure of deep water. His forward momentum was completely absorbed, his flailing hands finding no purchase, his body held suspended for a moment in his lunge. He was pushing with all his might against nothing, and he could not move forward. He was utterly, completely, and absolutely powerless. The two figures, the man of mist and the shadow of memory, simply held his gaze for a long, silent moment. Their presence was not a threat, it was a final judgment. They did not need to strike him or condemn him with words. Their very existence, standing tall and free before him, was his sentence. In their calm, untroubled gaze, Vance saw the reflection of his own tyranny, the hollowness of a power that was built on nothing but the submission of others. He saw the faces of all the people he had ever broken. The boy beneath the hanging tree, the men and women who had flinched from the rap of his cane. He saw his entire life a monument to a cruelty that had ultimately imprisoned him more than any of his slaves. Then, as slowly and as silently as they had appeared, they began to dissolve. Their forms loosened, the sharp edges of their silhouettes softening, bleeding back into the white vapor from which they had been born. Within seconds they were gone, reclaimed by the fog, leaving Elias Vance completely and utterly alone on the silent road. The confrontation, or lack thereof, did not just break his spirit, it shattered the very foundations of his sanity and authority. The invisible barrier had been the final, undeniable proof of his impotence. He stumbled backward, his arms falling limp at his sides, a low, wounded animal sound escaping his lips. He turned and staggered back towards his carriage, his movements no longer those of a determined challenger but of a hollowed-out man, a scarecrow whose stuffing had been pulled out. He climbed into the carriage, his limbs heavy and uncooperative, and slumped onto the velvet seat. He did not take up the reins. The horse, sensing the profound shift in the atmosphere, the dissipation of the unnatural tension, began to walk of its own accord, slowly, carefully, pulling its broken master home. The plantation fell into disarray with a speed that was breathtaking. The master had returned, but he was a master in name only. His will was broken. He issued no orders, he met with no one, he simply sat in his dusty study, whispering to shadows that only he could see. The news of his final definitive collapse spread through the quarters like a slow, cleansing fire. Fear, the currency of the plantation's economy, had lost all its value. The work slowed, then nearly stopped. Without Finch to enforce discipline and with Vance lost in his own private hell, the intricate machine of oppression ground to a halt. His wealth tied up in land that was no longer productive and in a reputation that was now a whispered tale of madness, began to evaporate like morning mist. Creditors circled, then descended. Piece by piece, the Vance empire was dismantled. Elias Vance died a few years later, a recluse in a house that was no longer his passing barely noted by the world he had once sought to command. He was a man who had been defeated not by a weapon or an army, but by a story that had taken root in the red clay of a lonely Georgia road and had grown powerful enough to pull his entire world down with it. In the wake of Elias Vance's final silent collapse, a profound and unfamiliar quiet settled over the plantation. It was not the coiled, breath-holding silence of fear that had defined their lives for so long, but something new, a quiet born of a power vacuum. With Vance a whispering madman locked in his own house and Finch gone like a bad storm, the brutal machinery of oppression had lost its gears. The oppressive atmosphere, the constant grinding terror that had been the air they breathed, simply lifted. This did not mean freedom, not yet. The legal chains of bondage were still in place, but the daily, soul-crushing weight of immediate violence was gone. For the first time, the enslaved community could breathe. In this new, uncertain dawn, James became a leader. The fiery anger that had once burned so hot within him had been tempered by Sarah's wisdom and by the awesome, terrifying power of Tobias's story. He had learned that true strength was not always found in the clenched fist of rebellion, but sometimes in the quiet, unwavering endurance of the soul. He did not preach defiance or escape. Instead, he organized. He directed the tending of the communal gardens with a quiet authority, ensuring everyone had enough to eat as the plantation's official stores dwindled. He mediated disputes with a patience he hadn't known he possessed, his voice a low, steady presence that calmed frayed nerves. The story of Tobias was no longer a secret whisper shared in the dark. It became a foundational myth, a source of communal identity and pride, told openly around the evening fires. It was their story, their victory, a testament to a power that the masters could not comprehend, let alone defeat. James ensured the story was told correctly, not as a simple ghost tale, but as a history of spiritual liberation, a lesson in the true nature of freedom. Decades passed. The world turned upside down. The Great War came and went, its cannons and proclamations tearing down the old order and leaving a new, chaotic, and uncertain landscape in its place. By the 1880s, the word emancipation was a historical fact, though the reality of freedom for black folk in the South was a far more complicated and treacherous thing. It was into this world that a young, ambitious journalist from Philadelphia named Marcus Thorne traveled. He was a man of the new generation, born free in the North, educated at a fine institution, his mind sharp and his spirit filled with a fervent desire to document the history of his people, a history that had for so long been written only in scars and sung only in sorrow. He traveled south with a satchel full of notebooks and a belief in the power of the written word, collecting the oral histories of the formerly enslaved, determined to build an archive of their experiences before the last generation, to know the whip passed into memory. In a small town near the Georgia coast, while interviewing an old man who had worked the rice fields, he first heard a fragmented version of the legend. The old man spoke of a haunted road, a master who went mad, and a slave who vanished into the fog, leaving only his master's cane standing impossibly upright in the road. Marcus, a man of logic and reason, was initially dismissive, filing it away as a curious piece of local folklore. But the story stuck with him. He heard it again from a woman in a Savannah market, this time with the detail of the two shadows walking side by side. Intrigued by its persistence and its strange poetic details, his journalistic instincts took over. This was more than a simple ghost story. It had the weight and texture of a significant event, a memory that had been polished into a legend. He decided to investigate, to trace this strange tale back to its source. His search, a journey through dusty county records and long conversations with the elderly, eventually led him to a small, neat cabin nestled in a grove of pecan trees near the overgrown skeletal ruins of what had once been the Vance plantation. There he found him, the man everyone said held the truest version of the tale, an elderly James. James's back was now bent with age, his hands gnarled from a lifetime of labor, but his eyes, when he looked up at the young, well-dressed journalist from the North, were clear, sharp, and held the deep, quiet wisdom of a man who had seen the world change in ways Marcus could only read about in books. Marcus introduced himself and explained his project, and James listened patiently, nodding slowly. They sat on the small shaded porch, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and the buzzing of bees. Finally, Marcus asked about the story about Tobias of the cane. James was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the distant ruins of the great house. Then he began to speak, his voice a low, melodic rasp. And he told the journalist the full story. He recounted it not as a ghost tale full of spooks and specters, but as an act of profound spiritual resistance, a history lesson of the soul. "You city folk write things down in books," James said, his eyes finally turning to meet Marcus's. "You think that makes it true. Our history, the real history, we carry it inside. It's in the songs we sing, the stories we tell our children. It's in the way we stand, the way we look at the world." He leaned forward slightly, his presence commanding. "Tobias, he didn't just run from something. He walked to something. He was the quietest man I ever knew. But he understood power in a way even Master Vance never could. He knew that the master's power wasn't just in the whip or the law. It was in the way he made you see yourself as something less than a man. That cane. James shook his head slowly, a look of awe still in his eyes after all these years. That cane was everything. It was Vance's pride, his cruelty, his family's history of hate, all carved into a piece of wood. Tobias showed us that a master can own your body, but he can't own your soul unless you let him. He left the cane, but he took his soul with him, and in doing so, James's voice dropped to a near whisper, full of a deep, resonant emotion. He gave a piece of it back to all of us. Marcus sat in stunned silence, the pen in his hand forgotten. The story, as James told it, was no longer just a piece of folklore. It was a theological text, a declaration of spiritual independence more powerful than any political document. He had come seeking a story, and he had been given a revelation. Deeply moved, the journalist thanked the old man and left the cabin as dusk was beginning to settle, turning the sky to shades of lavender and rose. He felt compelled to walk down the old, overgrown red clay road, the path that was the stage for this incredible history. The air grew cooler, and just as James had described, the fog began to roll in from the marshes, silent and thick, swallowing the landscape. He walked slowly, the world growing quiet and muffled around him until he found a spot that felt right, a place where the trees seemed to lean in as if to listen. He stopped, standing in the center of the road, trying to imagine the scene, the impossible cane, the dissolving man. He stood there for a long time, lost in thought, the fog swirling around his ankles like a living thing. He was about to turn back when he saw it. Far down the road, at the very edge of his vision where the fog was thickest, he saw a movement. He squinted, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. For a fleeting, impossible moment, as the mist swirled and parted, he saw them. Two tall shadows, walking side by side in the distance. Their forms were indistinct, woven from the gray twilight and the shifting fog, but their posture was unmistakable. They walked with a calm, unhurried grace, not as a master and a slave, but as equals, two sovereign spirits taking a peaceful evening stroll. Then the fog swirled again, a thick curtain of white, and they were gone. Marcus stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat. It was a trick of the light, he told himself, a phantom created by the fog and an old man's powerful story. But as he stood there on that sacred ground, he knew it was more than that. He was a man of facts and documented truths, but he understood in that moment that some histories are too deep to be contained in books. The legend of Tobias Carter was a permanent part of the landscape, a story that lived in the red clay and breathed in the evening mist. It was a story that reminded all who heard it that the most powerful chains are not always made of iron, and that true freedom, the freedom that allows a man's soul to stand up straight, is a state of being that no master can ever truly conquer. He finally turned and walked away, his notebook forgotten in his satchel. His mind no longer on the story he would write, but on the profound, enduring truth he had just been shown.